So it's tricky because we can't see all of our participants. Are we up and running? Should we give it a couple minutes?
Yeah, it seems like folks are trickling in right now. So
Great.
A while for folks to arrive.
As folks are trickling in, you are here for Shellfish Day number 2 webinar, and we'll start in a couple minutes once everybody's got a chance to log on. Hi, everyone. As you're logging in, you are on Shellfish Day number 2, and we'll just give it another minute or two before we get started with today's program. Let folks log in. All right, well, maybe we will go ahead and get started. Does that sound good, Anne?
It does.
Awesome. And I suspect people will keep trickling through, but we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. This is Shellfish Focus Day event number 2, What's Changing on the Mudflats. This is the second in a 3-part series of events to highlight Maine's shellfish populations and their industries. The series is being sponsored by the Maine Fishermen's Forum as part of the suite of programs that the forum is offering this year in lieu of the annual in-person event that we would normally have attended together a couple weeks ago in Rockland. But as we all know, that was canceled due to the global pandemic. So as many of you know, the full Thursday event at the Maine Fishermen's Forum is usually dedicated to sharing information and research updates, restoration successes, and a lot more related to Maine shellfish. So this webinar series is an attempt to keep the information flowing because, pandemic or not, there's a lot going on in the world of shellfish. So my name is Natalie Springuel. I work for the Maine Sea Grant program, and I'm excited to be with you all here today to help facilitate this conversation between all of the panelists that you're seeing on your screen. We're going to hear from lots of folks today, which is great, and all of you who are participating as attendees on this webinar. I also wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and that a shortened version of the webinar will be rebroadcast on the radio on Friday, March 26 from 4 to 5 p.m. on Maine Sea Grant's public affairs radio program called Coastal Conversations, which airs on WERU Community Radio at 89.9 FM and streaming online at weru.org. And the radio broadcasts of all 3 of our webinars in this series will be available for listening anytime after the podcast. So lots of ways to hear this great content and these great voices. Just by reminder, the first topic in the series from last month covered shellfish harvesting for the future, and it included efforts to restore clam flats in various areas of the coast. And the third topic in the series, which will air in April, that will explore shellfish markets and the seafood supply chain. For information about all these events, especially the upcoming ones, we recommend that you follow the Maine Fishermen's Forum Facebook page, as they're doing a great job of staying up to date on all of these and other Fisherman Forum events that are slated to occur this winter and spring in 2021. So today, let's get on with today. Today we're talking about what's changing on the mudflats, and I'm excited for the observations and the knowledge that all of our panelists will bring to the table about changes they are observing in shellfish populations and habitats, and how and why they're monitoring these changes. In terms of logistics, we'll start first with a panel of harvesters whose knowledge is grounded in being out there all the time. And then we'll segue to a panel of researchers who will bring us up to speed on a variety of mudflat monitoring projects and recent methods to collect data about shellfish. And we'll make sure to leave lots of time for Q&A and conversation between and after the two panels. So before we introduce our guests, we wanted to provide some context on why we care about mudflats and the importance of collecting both researcher and harvester knowledge. So to help with that context, I wanted to invite Ann Hayden to share some thoughts. Many of you know Ann. She is the fisheries program manager at Manomet and has been involved in shellfish issues for a long time. So she can help us frame the conversation today. So Ann, it's all yours.
Thanks a lot, Natalie. Excited to be here and really looking forward to the program. So Maine's shellfish flats are very dynamic places, changing with the seasons, storms, and the tides. They're also affected by what happens in the watershed. Runoff can carry excess nutrients, contaminants, or bacteria. And both erosion and shoreline hardening affects the flats. Obviously, harvesting also affects the flats, but the biggest human-caused impact on them may be climate change. As we have all heard, the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the rest of the world's oceans. And because the marine environment is so dynamic, changing all the time, the impacts of climate change are felt more quickly on the water than on the land. And some impacts are pretty clear. The explosion of green crabs due to warming waters has done a number on clams up and down the coast. Other impacts are less obvious. Quahogs seem to be doing better, at least in the southwestern part of the state. Is it due to a natural cycle of ups and downs? Do they thrive in warmer waters? Are they less vulnerable to predators because they have thick shells that close tightly? Will they expand to eastern Maine? So many questions. To discuss what's happening on the flats and what we might do to track these changes, we've asked harvesters and researchers to share their observations. Harvesters collect information every time they're out on the flats, and they use it when deciding when, where, or if to harvest and to identify trends. And the harvesters on our panel today they all serve on their town's shellfish committee. Maine's intertidal shell fisheries are managed at the municipal level, and they put their knowledge to use in managing the town's shellfish program. Our researchers have conducted studies on clams, their predators, and harvester knowledge. Each is developing new approaches to understanding the changes happening on our flats. And we're so grateful that each panelist has agreed to share some thoughts today, and excited to see what questions their collective understanding, their observations inspire from you, the audience. Back to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Ann. That was really helpful to sort of ground us in what we're about to do for the next hour and a half or two. Welcome to the folks who have logged on since we started. So we're going to go ahead and get this ball rolling. The only other thing I wanted to add is if you have questions or comments that you wanted to pose to any of the panelists, feel free to start putting them into the Q&A at any time. And I suspect everyone knows how to do it, but if not, you basically scroll to the bottom of your screen assuming you're on a computer, and you will find your settings, your sort of control panel. Click on the Q&A where it says Q&A, and that will open up a Q&A box. So you can type your question in there, or you can type your comment in there as well. And we'll be monitoring those throughout the duration of the webinar. If you have a question or a comment specifically to one of the panel members, let us know so we know who to address it to. But general open questions are great too. So with that, I wanted to welcome our first panel onto our webinar. So we have Nate Orff, who's a harvester, and he is the chair of the Scarborough Shellfish Conservation Commission. Hi, Nate.
Hi, Natalie. How's it going? I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. It's great to have you, Nate. And then we're kind of working our way up the coast, by the way, from south to north. So moving up the coast, we'll also hear from Kevin Oliver, who's a harvester and a member of the Yarmouth Shellfish Conservation Commission. Hi, Kevin.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Great. Good to have you. And then we'll have Joanie Mcdonald, who's a harvester and is a Shellfish Advisory Council member, and she's from Georges River. Hi, Joanie.
Hello, Natalie. Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you. And then of our harvester panel, last but not least, we have Bailey Bowden, who's a harvester and chair of the Penobscot Shellfish Conservation Committee. Hi, Bailey.
Hi, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Great, thanks. So we're just going to go ahead and get started. And what we're going to ask these four panelists to do, and we'll go in the same order that we just did with introductions, is we'll ask you guys to share a little bit about what the species are that you harvest or that are harvested in your town by your fellow shellfish harvesters. And what are some of the changes that you're seeing in your mudflats and from your shellfish, and sort of what are the things that you're really sort of paying attention to that's caught your attention and that you're thinking about right now related to the flats in your communities. And we'll give each of these folks a few minutes to kind of share their story so we can get to know what they're observing. And let's go ahead and start with Nate Orff from Scarborough.
Hi. So Scarborough is a really unique estuary in the way that the whole entire estuary, the only harvestable area in Scarborough, kind of all comes from the one river that comes out, Scarborough River. The Scarborough River is only 100 yards wide at low tide, and it feeds a massive estuary that has 3 separate rivers that are the most frequently clammed areas in the town. The only real commercial clamming we have is digging steamer clams, soft shell clams. There's no commercial harvestable quahog population in the town right now, which a lot of our harvesters think that's going to change, as there has been a slight uptick in the amount of quahog seed and juveniles being found in the past few years. There's 3 different aquaculture operations all growing oysters in the town, and there has not been any more aquaculture operations coming in because of the endangered bird habitat being located in the estuary. So the focus of our Shellfish Conservation Commission is strictly soft shell clam management. We don't have any other species that we really need to manage. We have a lot of sandy bottom and a lot of mud bottom, and a lot of our areas get very high currents because of the water traveling in and out of such a narrow channel to get into our flats. We've been studying the different effects of predation. We have a very high population of milky ribbon worms in certain areas. We have a lot of green crabs, and we've been looking for ways to mitigate that and deal with that. The past few years have been very bountiful years for the town of Scarborough. There's been a lot of clams around. A lot of the diggers think it's the best it's been in the recent history. Same with the high price that has been demanded for soft shell clams recently. But yeah, that's about what's happening in Scarborough right now on the clam flats.
That's great. Thank you, Nate. That's a really great overview to help us kind of picture what's happening down there. I also wanted to just remind our panelists that if you have any thoughts or questions for each other, just write them down so you remember them, because we're really going to want to capture that, capture those questions from each other later in the webinar. So next we're going to hear from Kevin Oliver from Yarmouth. Give us a sense, Kevin, of what you're observing on the flats and sort of what are the key species that are being harvested and what your town is up to.
Well, good afternoon again, everybody. My name's Kevin Oliver. I'm on the North Yarmouth Shellfish Commission for over 15 years. I've been harvesting clams, just soft-shelled clams, for over 20. We've seen a number of changes over the years. Some of the sedentary changes we've noticed, some of the coves silting up, some of the coves being wiped away, the silt being taken right off the top, and we wind up with a hard pack. We have two rivers that kind of dump into our bay, adding some fresh water. Those rivers have notoriously been good for clam harvesting. One of them is a prohibited area. We've experienced a very, very significant amount of what's called depuration harvesting of polluted areas over the past 15 years. And a lot of people have suspected that that's partially led to the depletion of the resource in our town. Historically, we've found that, clams would go way out, hundreds of yards out to the channels and areas. And now we're finding just these thin belts of clams along the shoreline in intermittent patterns. It's been pretty alarming, and I'm very concerned about the future of soft-shell clam harvesting in our town. We'd like to start focusing more over the years to try to stop the predation. Like most towns, we had a very significant uptick in green crab populations and predation starting about 10 years ago or so. One of the things that is important that I'm really glad to have harvesters on here today to be able to talk to people is because we're the front line. We're the ones that see this the most. For years, we'd complained about the green crab invasion and stuff, and you go to local shellfish meetings and local town council meetings, and you get up and you address the situation, but it takes a long time for administrators to start to dig in, and find out 2 years later, and I don't know how much money later, they decide, yes, we do have a green crab problem. So, it's important for the harvesters to come forward and to have these discussions with the townspeople and the people making the rules.
Thank you, Kevin. Can I ask you a follow-up question? Could you define for folks what depuration harvesting means? You're back on mute. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Depuration harvesting is done through a corporation or a company that comes in and they dig in a polluted or conditionally closed, prohibited areas. Most of these areas are restricted for harvesting for wild clam harvesters. And these clams go to a plant where they are cleaned and inspected and deemed safe for human consumption. So in one way, it's a great way to take advantage of some of these resources. But these river shed areas are responsible for a significant amount of seed going out into the water supply, I suspect. So there's, like most things, it's a double-edged sword.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna bump up the coast a little bit to Georges River and hear some thoughts and observations from Joanie Mcdonald. Hi, Joanie.
Well, hello, good afternoon. My name is Joanie Mcdonald, and first I'd like to thank all of you that made this possible for us to be able to come on here and share our concerns. And I love getting the community involved. So thank you very much. And like I said, my name is Joanie, and I dig as a digger on the St. George River. I'm on the Shellfish Committee, like you said, in the shack, excuse me. Our digging area consists of 5 towns. We have Thomaston, South Thomaston, St. George, Cushing, and Warren. We dig soft-shell clams, and most of our digging is done on the St. George. Excuse me, I think I need a drink. A lot of us that dig on the river are pickers. And what this means is it's very soft mud and we stick our hand in the mud and pull the clam out and then put it in our hod. We don't need to use a fork to pull the mud over. It's easier on our body too. I've been digging these areas for 20 years and I've seen many changes in that time frame. I've seen good clamming years and some not so good, but I have never seen it as bad as it's been the last 6 or so years. We watched our clams and mussel beds just disappear in a matter of months. They just went. Those of us that made our living from clamming had to seek other areas and oftentimes just head out to islands to dig because the clams would just, you couldn't make a living on the river anymore. We tried reseeding, but it seemed to not work anymore because we have always done this. But we're assuming the green crabs were eating it up. So we tried covering the planted seed with nets like they often have done in other towns. But the silt was so heavy from us having such soft mud that it would cover over the nets. And we think it was smothering the clams that we had planted. So that didn't work for us. Some other problems we had were the ribbon worms on top of the green crabs, just like the other communities. And we also have a fish. I can't think of the name of the fish. Maybe some of the other diggers will know when they come on. But it actually likes clams. It has a long nose and it would actually dig. You can see the holes where the fish would actually dig in eating the clams. So a lot of problems on the St. George. Let's see, some people think that a blight came through because they disappeared so quickly that maybe something made them all sick. Because like I said, the mussels disappeared also. We had tremendous mussel beds. Of course, it could have been just all part of all of it in a perfect storm. And we can't, of course, don't forget the climate change, of course, like I can't remember her name, she mentioned. That seems to have really accelerated. And the last Shellfish Zoom you had one of the gentlemen on there had mentioned that it accelerated to such a pace that probably the clams couldn't keep up with the changing. They probably could have adapted, but it was just so quickly they couldn't. And that made a lot of sense to me because I'm seeing clams come back now. So I'm assuming they're adapting to what's changing. On our river, we used to sell 140 commercial licenses, which is a lot, I believe, with a waiting list for people dying to get a license. But with the decline of the product, went a lot of the diggers, of course, having to find employment elsewhere. We have cut 20 licenses. We could cut more, but we have not. We've decided not to because we didn't have the sales. They weren't selling and the river couldn't sustain them anyways. But there is hope. The river has a few areas that are coming back. It's a bit spotty, but hopefully in time the areas will fill in. The clams are closer to the shore than normal. And like that last guy just said, they don't seem to be going out towards the river anymore. They're staying close in, and hopefully in time that'll fill in and go out, I hope. I've also noticed that the tides don't go out as far. And if they do, they're very short-lived and it comes in a lot quicker than it ever did before. Some of our coves were having a problem with brown and green algae growing on them, and there's no clams. It's like that's smothering the clams also. So with the help of our area biologist and Hannah and some extra water quality testing, we found that the algae could be from fertilizers, actually people fertilizing their lawns, and washing down after a rain into the water. So through the water testing, we have found a problem with dog waste also, up and down the whole coast of our towns. So these are our goals for this year, to educate the public about the two major concerns that we have found out about, the fertilizers and the dog waste. Number two, we're going to try to get more youth involved in digging. It seems like our population of diggers are aging, and we haven't got many new ones coming in. So we're giving out 5 free licenses to our students to be able to try it out. The first timers that haven't had a license before. Also, we have a science project going on that has been delayed because of COVID of last year. And we're in hopes to find out analyze the flow of our river to know where, if we do replant some seed, where we would do that. I know they did it in Waldoboro. I'm not sure of the results there though. Also, we plan on continuing shoreline cleanups, which we have several of them a year. And we always haul off at least a pickup truckload of trash out of each event. So I have to say we have a very good group of committee members, and they're made up of the diggers and the community as well. And they bring good ideas and manpower when needed. And our committee leader, which is David Taylor, he goes above and beyond for our river. He just really has a passion for the program, and he even misses work and everything to take care of things, but he's really good. So I want to thank you all for listening to me, and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Joanie. It's so interesting to me, relating back to what Anne was saying in her opening comments about how our shellfish is managed locally, and sort of that interconnection between the harvesters and the local management and the restoration efforts. I think is just so unique to this industry. It's really great to hear these stories. Not as great to hear the stories of decline though. So continuing to move up the coast, our final harvester for today is Bailey Bowden, who is from Penobscot. Bailey, welcome aboard.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'd like to start by saying where Penobscot is. Most people are wondering that. We are the first town east of the Penobscot River, and we are on our own river system known as the Bagaduce River. Our main shellfish harvesting area, our main harvest is soft shells. And we are pretty much a complete estuary up here. And at the head of the river, we have an 800-acre tidal flat that is composed of really, really fine silty mud that at one time was as much as 18 inches deep, up to your knees. If you lingered, you were going to sink. And in the last year, we've noticed that that's no longer the case. Our flats are now rock hard almost everywhere. That will be our project for this summer, seeing if the mud has migrated from the south to the west, from the west to the easterly side of the bay, because that's the way the wind predominantly blows here. I've been looking at this bay for over 50 years, and in the last 15 years, there are rocks appearing that have never been there. So my question has been, where are these rocks coming from? We've always thought maybe somehow they're rising, but now we're beginning to wonder if the mud hasn't been receding and the rocks were at the same level. The problem there is the bottom layer is just like concrete, and we're really afraid that clams are not going to be able to burrow in if we had any clams left. So I'll circle back to that. In 2012, we were ground zero for the green crab invasion. Prior to that, our harvests were around 150,000 pounds a year. And in 2013, after the green crabs came, our landings dropped to 60,000, and the following year to 10,000, and the following year to 0. And I doubt we land more than 200 pounds of clams here in a summer now. All orders, anyone that goes clamming is just taking an order for their neighbor, basically, and doing a favor and getting some clams, for their friends. Most everyone has taken another job. There is one guy that was fortunate enough to get an out-of-town license in another town, so he's able to continue, his passion in that town. But as far as Penobscot goes, it's really not looking good. We have tried everything the state has recommended since 2008 when we started, and that was with brushing programs, roughing the flats, you name it, we've tried it. We have probably had the most experimental or special licenses granted by DMR of any shellfish committee in the state. We've thought outside the box for 5 or 6 years on how to combat green crabs, how to bring our shellfish back. We've worked with Dr. Brian Beal on ways to do that. I mean, we even went to a closed area in a neighboring town and took out their large breeders, the 5 and 6 inch clams, out of a prohibited area right at the end of a wastewater treatment facility, and brought them back into our town and put them in a prohibited area at the end of a OBD, overboard discharge. And we hope that those huge clams might help reseed or repopulate the flats. And that really didn't seem to have any effect. And we've just come to the conclusion that there are just so many green crabs that the clams can't produce fast enough to outpace predation. And it's not just the green crabs. We also have a lot of entomorpha, which is that green algae stuff that's on top of the flats. An interesting note this year in the spring with the drought, we didn't have hardly any of the entomorpha on the flats. But when September came and we finally got some rain, that stuff exploded everywhere and covered 800 acres of flats with this green stuff. And what that does is it prevents the juvenile clam from actually settling in the mud. So it is settled inside this mat, kind of a picture of Brillo pad, I guess, if you're not familiar what this stuff looks like. So the clam, the seed clam, is suspended, and that's just open prey for any seagull, duck, bird, raccoon, anything that wants to come along. It doesn't even have to pick it out of the mud. It's sitting right on the top, and it's a white speck in a green mat. It shows up, from a long ways away. And we really don't know what we're going to do here. We're unfortunately really thinking about giving up on Northern Bay, especially with the loss of the soft mud, and having to start concentrating on some of the areas in town that have more of a gravel-based bottom, and moving our shellfish efforts elsewhere. But the sad issue there is we don't have a lot of shorefront going down the sides of the river at low tide, whereas we have this great 800-acre bowl, which could fit a lot of harvesters up here. So we don't have a lot of real estate once we run out of this big bay. And I guess I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bailey. And thanks to all 4 of you. This is incredibly interesting. And I would love to ask you guys, the 4 of you, sort of, what are you hearing from each other that you're like, oh, that's happening to me too? I mean, there's a few things several of you have said related to predation, to algae getting in the way, to sort of the mud, the changing nature of the mud. What are you hearing from each other that really resonates or makes you realize that, oh, that's happening over there too? What were some surprises or confirmation that you heard from each other?
So one thing that we're getting that I guess is pretty similar to that is that algae. A couple of years ago, there's one other river in Scarborough, the Spurwink River. A couple of years ago, there was a seed set over there, which in my 9 years of commercial clamming, I've never dug in the Spurwink, and no one ever does. And there was a seed set. There was a lot of clams. We went in there and we did really good for a few days. And we came back like 2 months later, and the entire area was covered with like an inch thick layer of that slimy green algae moss or whatever it is. And it was gone. Everything was smothered. All the life was gone. And it was interesting. There wasn't much other, like not a lot of snails around. It didn't seem, not a lot of crabs, just algae everywhere from bank to bank.
Interesting. Thanks, Nate. Anyone else? Kevin or Joanie or Bailey?
We've seen a number of things take place. We used to have clams that go out farther. And it's hard to figure out exactly what variable is causing it. We'd have large quantities of seed clams out on the edges along the channels, and we would have wormers come in and flip that over like 3-4 times in a week. We've had a small explosion of those ribbon worms that have been chewing up a lot of stuff. It's very hard to document and track why these things are taking place, the exact cause. And I think it's just the aggregate of all these things combined that are leading to a depletion in our town.
Yeah. Let's go to Joanie and then Bailey.
I was going to say about Bailey and the mudflats being so hard. We had the same problem. They just were very hard, and we just assumed it was because of the mussel beds leaving, or we didn't know because it used to block things in. So we just all took to hoe digging with our forks instead of picking with our hands. And I think that helped soften it up again. And now we're back to picking a lot of the areas. So that was it.
Yeah, I actually left some sticks out in the mud. They were left over from the Beal box study. We broke the sticks off and they were still there. So I've been able to use them as a little bit of a gauge as to what's happening with the mud level and the water level on top of the mud, because it is really silty. And I began noticing this 3 years ago that, one time there'd be an inch of that stick sticking out of the mud. And if we had a good storm that blew southwest, there could be 10 or 12 inches of that stick sticking out of the mud. So it became apparent to me that that mud is moving. And what is that going to do to the juveniles that are trying to settle in that mud? Do they become buried too deeply so their siphon doesn't reach the surface and they can do their thing? I'm not really sure about that. One thing I would like to mention about with the depuration digging is before we had our big crash in 2012, depuration was up here digging 150 to 250,000 pounds in a month in July with 30 harvesters every day. So we don't know how many clams were left that didn't get picked up and were left for the seagulls or died in the mud. But I'm sure that level of intense harvest had to have some sort of negative effect on the standing crop. And then when you add the green crabs came in to boot, that was just another nail in the coffin. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So I wanted to invite if anyone from the attendees have questions for our panelists to sort of clarify what their observations are. You can feel free to put your questions into the Q&A. I don't think we're seeing any yet. Yeah, feel free to add some questions in there. If not, then we can also catch the questions in a few minutes. But I think we will, in that case, move on to our researcher panel and encourage the harvesters to think of questions that you're going to want to ask of the researchers. This is just like looking at all the windows that I'm seeing here. There's a collected knowledge across the research and the shellfish community that is just really exciting. So I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation once we've heard some basics of what our researchers are up to. So our research panel is made up of Sara Randall from the Downeast Institute. Hi, Sarah.
Good afternoon, Natalie. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And then, hi, Denis. We've got Denis Nault from the Maine Department of Marine Resources.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Great, thanks for coming, Denis. We have Marissa McMahan from Manomet. Hi, Marissa.
Hi, thanks, Natalie. I'm excited to continue hearing all this great information.
Great. And we also have Sarah Risley from the University of Maine Darling Center. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks.
And I just wanted to acknowledge that Marissa and Sarah have also been pretty instrumental in helping Anne put this panel together. So thanks to putting this whole webinar together, not just this panel, but the whole shebang. So thanks to all of you. So welcome aboard to our researchers. And let's go ahead and start with Sara Randall from the Downeast Institute. If you could share a little bit about what you're up to these days and why. And also, I know that at least I think a couple people mentioned Beal boxes. So at some point, it would be great to have you explain what a Beal box is.
Definitely. So, yeah, I've been conducting research in the intertidal since right after what has now become known as the ocean heat wave of 2012, where we experienced really high ocean temperatures. Although in general, our ocean temperatures, especially in Maine, have been increasing over the past 40 years as an impact of climate change. This ocean heat wave time period was a time when clammers were observing larger amounts of green crabs on the flats, so much to the effect of at the end of a tide, they would be attacking the clams that the clammers had just dug. So that's when I began doing this research. And ever since then, I've been working on trying to figure out ways to protect clams from predators and to learn more about what's happening in the intertidal ecosystem. And yes, one of the tools that we use in my opinion, like the most exciting, tool is these Beal boxes, which we sometimes also call recruitment boxes. And they're very simple. They're a wooden frame that has a mesh on the top and the bottom. And it's a small mesh, but clams, when they settle out of the water column, are smaller than the mesh. So the clams, when they settle out, are 1/5 of a millimeter, and they can fit inside the mesh, inside the box. And so when we put these out on the flats, the clams that actually settle into the box can survive because they're protected from most predators, and the clams inside them can grow. And from these boxes, we can learn so much. We can learn about what species are settling to the mudflats and, how many and what their growth rates are. And then also when we sample the mud adjacent to the boxes, we can learn about how many clams of the clams that recruited or settled onto that mud flat are surviving. And we use these Beal boxes. We put them out in May before the clams start to spawn, and we leave them on to the mud flats until November, which is when the clams tend to stop growing because they put their effort into, it's colder water, so they put their effort into other matters besides growing. And since 2015, I've been using these Beal boxes up and down the coast to learn more about the clams that are recruiting and how many. And it's really been a huge eye opener, because basically what I see in the different towns that I'm in is that when I put the Beal boxes out and I look at what is inside the Beal boxes at the end of the year, inside those boxes are hundreds, if not thousands, of clams. And in the mud beside them, I'm lucky to find 1 or 2 clams that have survived. So what I'm seeing, if we don't protect clams from predators, I don't find clams, and unless in some areas of the high intertidal, which is the area that is exposed 2 to 3 hours before low tide. And so that's what I see pretty much everywhere that I'm going. And in the last year, 2020, we established softshell clam recruitment monitoring sites in 9 different towns across the state. From Wells, we also have 2 sites in Scarborough with Nate, on up to Sabayak. And in each of these towns, we have 2 monitoring sites that we're collecting information on. And so we're learning a lot, and this is going to be like really important baseline data, so we can sort of understand like trends in recruitment, trends in survival. We also measure temperature, so we can see the trends in temperature and maybe figure out if there's any there's many things we can figure out basically, and we can also see what kind of species are recruiting to those areas. So I'm happy to talk about more about that. So I guess I would just say that the Beal boxes have allowed us to understand that the areas that we're thinking of as dead mud aren't dead really, because they're actually experiencing large amounts of recruitment in some cases. But it's just that those clams that recruit, they are not surviving that critical like early first year of life, because clams need to, they need 2 years. They need at least to survive 1 year to reach a harvestable size in the state, which is 2 inches. So getting them through that first year of life is crucial if we want them to reach harvestable size, which we do.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so not dead mud. They just need time to grow, is what I'm hearing you say, without getting eaten beforehand. Yeah.
Yes.
Great, great. And can you just define the term recruitment for us?
Yes. So clams have different sections of their life cycle, and they have this plankton. So sperm and egg meet in the water column, and they form a planktonic, a larval stage, which they're in the water for 2 to 3 weeks. And then they settle out of the water column onto the mud. And it is at that point when people come and see where the clams are on the mud, we call those recruits. So we say, oh, the clams have recruited to the mudflats there.
Great, thank you. Thank you, I appreciate that. Okay, let's go next to Denis Nault from the Department of Marine Resources. Hi, Denis.
Hello, I am Denis Nault with the Maine Department of Marine Resources. I am the supervisor of the Municipal Shellfish Management Program. And that's a program that's been around for quite a long time period. I have 3 area biologists that cover sections of the coast and the towns. So I have Heidi Layton, Hannah Annis, and Ari Leach. They cover their respective coasts from Downeast to southern Maine. There's a total of about 74 towns with ordinances and management, and they're kind of split evenly through the area biologists. We have a challenging job, never mind just doing the area biologist side. There's 150,000 intertidal acres in the state of Maine, of which there's about 84,000 acres, intertidal acres of clam flats itself. So over a shoreline of 3,400 miles of shoreline, that's a challenge for 3 area biologists. We wouldn't be able to get what's going on without having every one of these municipalities and these shellfish committees participating in this program. They are the key to the eyes and the ears on the flat initially. So with that, we've always been fighting from the backside. How do we look at and stay on top of things? Certainly it was evident in the 2012-2013 year with the green crab bomb that went off, that, it came up and literally bit us. So how do we start looking at and monitoring on the long-term side? Bailey said it clearly too. They were unfortunate to first get nailed with moon snails, and then after the moon snails were eating their clams, the green crabs came in and ate the moon snails, which were eating the green crabs, which were eating the clams also. So starting this year, from some work that we've been looking at doing, we are instituting what's called these long-term environmental monitoring sites. We're picking 3 sites or 3 towns across the coast, 2 sites in each town as a baseline to start out. These will be Machiasport, Dare Isle, Stonington, and Phippsburg. So each one of the area bios will have a town, 2 flats in each town. We'll establish these as our long-term monitoring sites for numerous things. So not only will we be putting down some recruitment boxes with DEI to look at settlement on a long-term basis as opposed to short-term, we'll also be doing and conducting different forms of surveys. So, Kevin Oliver, Bailey, a lot of and Joanie are aware of when we conduct a regular clam flat survey, it's intensive. It takes a lot of time, money, and effort. And you get a good amount of information out of it, but it's a snapshot for what's there. Sometimes we need to do a quicker evaluation of what's there. for water quality changes, for depuration management plans, a whole host of things. How do we quickly do a rapid test on a flat to say, is it worth for the state to do a time, money, and effort to upgrade or downgrade, upgrade the water quality in those areas? Is it worthwhile for us to be putting, the town to be putting efforts in these areas? So how do we look at that? So we've developed what's called a walkover survey. It's a little bit less intensive than a clam flat survey, but it certainly will answer questions or create questions on, do we need to do more work or a more intensive survey in these areas? We also will be looking at doing these walkover or timed green crab surveys in these areas. So we'll be looking at a time survey of collecting green crabs almost on a monthly basis throughout the year annually. So we'll be able to determine size, sex, color, numbers of critters within that flat over a time period every month throughout the year. The biologists will also be doing a general walkover survey. So we're looking at and observing what's on that flat. Are we seeing enteromorpha? Are we seeing different types of algae on that flat at different time periods? We'll be looking at not just settlement of clams, but what about worms? What about, a whole host of other things? With that, as we refine this tool, and these are going to be our long-term sites, this is not short-term. We're looking at this as being a permanent survey and monitoring sites, environmental monitoring. We'll deal with, literally, we're going to be getting water temperatures throughout those time periods where they're there through data loggers. And then we start building a cassette. As we build this, then we can look at other municipalities doing something similar, maybe on a scaled back basis. Now we're capturing information and data of what's going on, because it's a $64 million question on why clams are settling and why they're not settling. Yes, we can look at landings data and we can say we had a decline after the green crab explosion in 2013. We're seeing a little bit of a bump up and rise up in landings. It's a little bit slow to recover, but what are those issues? What's going on there? We are seeing quahogs expanding in certain southern Maine areas. Is that a positive? Is that a negative? That's hard to say, but we're certainly seeing a transition from guys digging clams to digging quahogs in certain towns in southern Maine. So by us creating these long-term monitoring sites and looking at a different means for monitoring what's going on those flats, hopefully we don't get these issues with moon snails or green crabs, or other things. We can at least get a heads up of what's going on with better powers of observation on our side and work with the municipalities to tailor make them, because every town is completely different. What's happening in Yarmouth is going to be very much different than what's going on in Penobscot or Scarborough or in Georges River.
Thank you, Dennis. So that's going to be such an interesting project to see how it changes over the course of the coming years and what you're finding. So let's go next to Marissa McMahan from Manomet. Let's hear about what you guys are up to.
Great, thanks, Natalie. My name's Marissa McMahan. I'm the director of the Fisheries Division at Manomet. I'm also a member of the Shellfish Advisory Council, or what we call SHAC, along with Joanie, who's also a member. This is a committee that makes recommendations to the Department of Marine Resources and the Legislative Marine Resource Committee. But with my Manomet hat on, we work on a wide range of topics from ecosystem restoration to fisheries diversification, really all in an effort to support resilient and productive ecosystems and communities. So along those lines, we work closely with shellfish harvesters and municipal shellfish management committees. And one of the things that we're specifically working on right now is developing an ecological survey for the mudflats that potentially can be a tool for harvesters and municipal managers to use. And we're doing this because we've heard directly from harvesters that there's a need for a standardized survey methodology for collecting data that can be used for municipal management. That includes collecting information on commercially important species or shellfish species like softshell clams and quahogs, but also predators such as milky ribbon worms and green crabs, as well as other commercially important species that overlap in habitat like bloodworms and sandworms. So really getting a sense of the whole ecosystem. Ultimately, we want this survey to be comparable and or compatible with other surveys that are occurring. So we've been doing a lot of communicating with Denis and Sarah and others who are doing this type of work. So for instance, we want to be able to compare shellfish abundance collected in this survey we're developing to the data that the Department of Marine Resources is collecting in their clam surveys. We also want to be able to utilize this survey in combination with other efforts like the Downeast Institute's recruitment box surveys that Sarah was just talking about, which would really allow us to get an understanding of the whole picture from clam settlement to the harvestable stock to the predators influencing the system. We also want the final product to be something that is adjustable to accommodate whatever capacity exists and or whatever questions exist from place to place. So for instance, maybe in southern Maine, getting a handle on quahog abundance is really important, but that's less important in eastern Maine, where there's a different set of priorities and questions. And in terms of capacity, we realized that conducting a comprehensive survey of all of these species is really time consuming. So we ultimately want to be designing something that can be flexible and suit the capacity of whoever is conducting it. With that said, we're still in the early phase of developing this survey, and we're really at the stage of talking with harvesters and managers and other researchers to get feedback and input on the design. We aim to have sort of a first draft to test out this spring and early summer and iron out any of the kinks that we may have before, ultimately having more of a final product. So I just want to pause really quick for a minute though, and acknowledge that harvesters know more about the flats than any survey could ever tell us. Like Kevin said at one point, they are the front line. Or on the front lines. They're out there every single day in a way that scientists are not. So they already know where the high and low density spots are. They know how populations change from year to year. And Sarah Risley, who's going to be speaking next, is going to talk more about the importance of harvester knowledge. But I just want to wrap up by saying that we're not looking to develop a survey that tells harvesters what they already know. We really want feedback from harvesters and from town shellfish managers on what sort of questions they're asking right now, what sort of data would be useful in informing their management process, and what sort of tools we could develop that would be most useful. So I have taken a ton of notes so far from all of the harvesters on our panel. Algae has definitely popped up on my radar for sure. And I'm eager to hear if anyone has comments or thoughts on this subject when we get to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Marissa. Yeah, algae, that Enteromorpha, the green algae that bunches of you have talked about is really interesting. So we have one more researcher to hear from. There's been some questions coming in, so we're looking forward to that. And just so you guys know, after Sarah, we're going to ask the harvesters we're going to see if the harvesters have questions and comments for the researchers. So we'll start with that, and then we'll move on to the questions that you guys have been sending in. So feel free to keep the questions coming. And let's go to Sarah from the University of Maine Darling Marine Center. Sarah, what are you guys up to?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Sarah Risley, and I'm a marine biology and marine policy student with the University of Maine Darling Marine Center, based here in Walpole, Maine. And today I'm going to share a little bit about a local knowledge mapping study our team created to help understand shellfish populations and human use in 2 Maine river estuaries. And so since 2019, graduate and undergraduate students based at the Darling Marine Center, or the DMC, have led efforts to collect information on the area's shellfish populations in partnership with the Penobscot and Newcastle Joint Shellfish Committee. And this project also expanded in 2020 to include the town of Bremen on the Manomet River. And although we initially planned this past summer to move forward with traditional shellfish population surveys that Denis mentioned, sort of those labor intensive on the flats, COVID-19 and the safety restrictions that came with that put our fieldwork on hold for the season. And so in an effort to still collect information about the rivers for the towns, we developed a by mail mapping study to document what harvesters are seeing on the flats. And the hope here was that this information could help us identify areas that are important to the shellfish industry or had changed in some way, either say by like the number of soft-shell clams or the type of shellfish species, and just document these changes. And we also hope to be able to share information with the towns about some of the challenges harvesters are experiencing and just the general status of the shellfish resource. And so to do this study, we first called license holders in the towns to ask them if they'd like to help us with this research. And if they agreed, harvesters were then sent a map booklet in the mail. And the maps look similar to, say, the Maine Atlas or Gazetteer, where you had a large fold-out map showing the whole river and then zoomed in pages showing different sections. And so then harvesters place stickers on the map pages, those zoomed in pages, to show the locations of soft-shell clam, quahogs, razor clams, wild oysters, and marine worms. And they could also write in notes about things they've seen or just general observations about the flats and activity on the river. And once they finished the maps, the harvesters then did a phone interview with our team in which we asked them questions about what changes they see, how things have changed since their start of their career or when they began actually clamming, and what predators or other things might be affecting shellfish numbers. And so far, we're in the thick of kind of going through this data and uploading it and analyzing it. And currently we're using it to inform site selection for a long-term monitoring education program on the Penobscot River beginning this summer. Really sort of similar themes as we've sort of been hearing from other researchers, where we're looking at the full ecosystem. So looking at shellfish species, but also their predators. And we're also including, so what are people doing on the river? What's the human activity? Where is aquaculture taking place, boating, things like that. And we're also hoping to compile reports for the towns to talk about the state of the shellfish fishery, to kind of give them some information about that. And overall, we have learned a ton about these rivers from harvesters and plan to continue to do studies like this, where we document their local knowledge and get a glimpse into what's happening on the flats. And just overall, harvester voices are so important, and their knowledge can help support a resilient shellfish industry by informing research, conservation, and planning for the future in these rivers. So that's it for me, and I guess we'll move to questions.
Great, thank you, all four of you. This is super interesting. One just follow-up question that I had for all of you is, several of you talked about research projects that are making use of fishermen's knowledge, harvester knowledge, and that these projects are just kind of getting launched. I'm curious, is this a new approach in Maine, or has there been, I just want to hear a little bit more about the interface between the research community and the harvester community historically. And maybe Denis, you can help set the stage on that for how the two work together with the state to manage the flats.
Okay, sure, Natalie. So Maine is very unique in the country. Only 2 states in the country do what we do, Maine and Massachusetts. And it's our colonial blood. One of the first acts of the Maine State Legislature in 1821 was confer down the rights of managing shellfish resources to the municipalities. Certainly, it's grown and changed over the years, but we consider this a partnership. Yes, the DMR is the executor of those resources. However, we partner with the municipality. They have a choice. Yes, we want to have an ordinance to manage their flats. There are conditions under statute, laws, and regulations that they must adhere to manage them, because it's a state resource. And we work very closely with those harvesters and those shellfish committees on what's going on. And we find, like I said, there's a lot of flats and a lot of areas with a handful of us. And without that direct hands-on work with every one of the harvesters or the towns, it would be an impossible task for us. So without partnering well and listening and hearing what's going on with the harvesters and going out and making those observations with them, we wouldn't be able to be where we're at this point in time. So that is an important key, in my opinion, for where we're at.
Thanks. Anyone have anything to add on that thought? So, so I wanted to ask if our harvesters had any questions of the researchers, that stuff that's occurred to you as you were listening to the research reports, sort of stories you may have of having, you know, figured some stuff out because you were collaborating with researchers, or any follow-up questions specifically about research methodology and that sort of thing. Kevin.
Yes, thank you. I had a quick question for Sara Randall. As I was listening to you talk about the Beal boxes, I was curious to see if any pH tests had been performed next to these Beal boxes to see the acidity levels in the water or in the sediment.
Well, we are actually just got a grant for 2021 that will allow us to specifically do exactly that, Kevin. We are going to be looking at taking pH measurements and also some other measurements to help us calculate ocean acidification levels at or in the Beal boxes throughout the whole season, because we know that acidity does change throughout the year. So we're going to be looking at that at our 2 clam recruitment monitoring sites in Beals Island from May till November of next year, or of this year, and hope to be able to continue doing that kind of monitoring. And also in the past, we did also look at pH at during 6 different or 8 different experiments in Freeport. And again, so looking at the pH at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year, and then in 2016, we looked at it across the whole year and sort of trying to figure out if a process called sediment buffering using shell hash would actually have a positive effect on clam recruitment and survival. Unfortunately, when we did that, those set of experiments, we found that because predation levels are so high, if there is a beneficial effect of adding shell hash, that we can't see it. But we are, that being said, so another research project I'm involved in this coming year is going to be looking at that question again of using shell hash for ocean acidification. And we're going to be doing that in South Portland. And we're going to be taking those pH measurements and others to help us understand how much acidity is happening over the whole spring to fall. So that's going to be a really exciting project that we're going to, you know, gather more data and more understanding of how ocean acidification or acidity is impacting clams, and how, you know, possible ways to mitigate the impacts that we're seeing from climate change.
Great, thank you. I think I missed a comment from Bailey a couple minutes ago, and then I also saw that Joanie's got a comment in a minute. So let's go with Bailey.
I'll figure out how to unmute myself. Sorry. One thing I'd like to mention in response to Dennis, is the situation has gotten a lot better, probably in the last 10 years, but there is a huge sense of no trust between the department and commercial fishermen. And, you know, that's probably institutional, has gone on for a long, long time, which is why I'm glad to see academia get involved in this realm, because the harvesters can go to academia who can do the science and take those results to the state and say, this is what we found. This is no longer anecdotal. We've done the science. It may not be peer reviewed, but people that have a degree have had a chance to, you know, look at this. And my greatest example of this would be in 2013, our shellfish committee went to Booth Bay and met with just about everybody on DMR staff. They had a solid room completely full of biologists and managers and all kinds of people. And we told our story of woe, of how the green crabs had come in 1 year and wiped us out. And we were told that that was just physically impossible and there's no way that happened. So we left with the opinion that either we were too stupid to understand what we were seeing or we were lying, which is not a good place to be when you're trying to co-manage a resource with the state. And Denis has been exceptional. We have nothing but high praise for Denis and the biologists. They have worked their tails off to help us out of the situation we're in. But when you start getting into upper management, things seem to, the wheels fall off the train pretty quick. So I'm hoping this collaborative effort between the harvester, academia, and regulators can continue, because I think that's the only way that we're ever going to make any progress from the harvester's point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Bailey. Joanie.
There we go. Hello again. And I agree with Bailey. Things have gotten much better between the harvesters and DMR, Department of Marine Resources. I think they've come a long way. And I thank you for all that all these have said today. That's wonderful. I have a couple of things anyways. I had one for Sara Randall. There was no clams near the box or next to the box. Sarah, were there clams nearby? Like Kevin was saying, we have strips of clams coming in on our flats. So I was wondering if there were any nearby there. Were there any strips near the box?
Well, we've done these in so many places. It's hard to say like for a specific example, but we do a method of random sampling where we throw our sampler into the air. So we get like a area around the boxes. So in different places, there may be some clams like in the strips like you're describing, and other places not. Right. But it's definitely been that mixture. And I understand what you're talking about when you say strips. And I think that the thing to think about with those are like what kind of, if it's a spatial refuge of some kind for the clams. If you're talking about ones that are higher up, like closer to the shore, that tends to be a spatial refuge, right? For the clams. So that's what that trend that you and Kevin and I think Bailey had mentioned too, although he's expressing more, loss in his area. That's a trend that I see across the coast, and it's that high intertidals where the clams are still able to survive. And that's because in general, there's less predation there, because the areas closer to the low tide line is the areas that come under more predation. And I notice it too, because I'm originally from Freeport, and I grew up in a house that was near on the Harrisicot River. And in the 80s and 90s, it was common to see clammers up to the low tide line, like far out on the flat. Whereas now there's literally no clamming occurring in that cove at all in the Harrisicot, which is up in the closer to the mouth. So it's an area that's getting more predation compared to some of our more productive areas, which are in the higher reaches of the river of the Harrisicot, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And for Denis, I had a question. What about green crab traps? Do you think they're effective?
That's a good question, Joanie. It's having done green crab trapping in many fashions since the mid 80s, late 80s to present time period. We found when we were doing them, originally we were ringing the dinner bell. We actually did a market capture when we were moving the populations to the traps. So at time periods, could green crabs trapping work heavily to to protect or move them, but it's timing. If you think you're going to put out green crab traps and you're going to reduce the population of green crabs, don't bother, because you're not going to do it. You need to be looking at, can you reduce the size of that critter at a time period to try to control it, but still it is not likely on it. There are very limited means to controlling the green crabs. It's been here for right now 100 years in the state of Maine.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanie. Those are great questions. Did you have another one? You said you had a few, but I'm assuming no, since you put yourself on mute.
I have a general question, I
Yeah.
guess. Speaking to like the species composition of different flats around the state, I was wondering if anyone, harvester or researcher, has a specific example or like of a shift in species that has been the major composition of an area, like an area going from being harvested from soft shell clams to quahogs, and if that's had an effect on wiping out the prior species or how that's gone.
I could probably jump on that one pretty quickly, Nate. So what we are seeing, we're seeing a couple of the northern Casco Bay towns that are seeing that transition to quahogs. Brunswick in particular, we started seeing it a bit in a bit of the Yarmouth area and Freeport. We really started to explode in Harpswell and in Brunswick. But what we're seeing is they're transitioning the species from soft shell clam to quahog. Why? Because, well, it's a per piece as opposed to a per pound. The numbers are there. And are we seeing a drop off on or them taking over the area? No, it's a little bit different type of habitat. Quahogs have been around forever. There's a reason why you have Quahog Bay in Harpswell. History of quahogs, the reason why Middle Bay in Brunswick was closed for dragging of quahogs in the 70s was because the 60s they depleted them by physically dragging them away. So they literally destroyed the population from over harvesting. We're now hand harvesting, we're not dragging. It's putting more eggs in one basket. So we're starting to see guys digging quahogs in the summertime period at a per piece on a much higher number than they are clams, and then transition to clams in the winter time period. As you've seen, Nate, and you've probably seen it too, Kevin, the price of clams in the winter time period now is a lot higher than it's been, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. And that's a positive on the market side into the harvesters. So you're getting a better price for that product. But we are seeing several towns doing that transition. Time will tell to see how that works out. I don't know. But it's good to be able to have them let one population rest when they can work on a different species at a time period. My concern is quahogs are much slower growing than clams. Where do we balance the act on potentially over harvesting on it? I don't think it's a concern yet, but it's something that we should think about.
It's a great question, Nate. Thank you, Dennis. And Sarah, I think that it seemed like you had something to say a couple minutes ago, and Bailey, I see your hand as well. Maybe I misunderstood facial expressions.
Did you mean me?
Yes, Sara Randall, sorry.
So what I would sort of say to Nate's last question is when I look at the recruitment boxes, so at this point I've done hundreds, if not thousands of these things. And I will say that the quahogs don't recruit the same way that clams do. In the recruitment boxes, like I said, we'll find hundreds or thousands. This year we found our record number of clams that we ever found in a box in Sabayak. We found over 4,000 clams in one box in Sabayak, and that was our record. Previously, our record was like 2,000 something in Freeport. When we find quahogs, we will find them in much smaller amounts. Like maybe if I get a box with like 10 quahog recruits in it, that's like a lot. So they just don't recruit the same way. And then when I talk to other researchers, like from down south, they sort of say that the same thing about the recruitment of quahogs. So sometimes when I hear people talking about depending on quahogs now, for like that can replace the losses in soft shell clams, I worry because I know that they're not recruiting at that same level to our flats. So it's a mistake to me to discount. We've got a lot of problems that we need to solve with the soft shell clams because of the high levels of predation they're experiencing. But I do not think that we in Maine, as Mainers, should discount the soft shell clam because this is these animals reach maturity, or they reach harvestable size much quicker. They're faster growing, like Denis said, and this has been the workhorse and sort of like the bread and butter of our state for so long. We just really can't give up on them.
Yeah, great question or comment, Sarah. Let's go to Bailey. I think you had something, and then I want to put Marissa on the spot because I know you know a lot about quahogs.
Yes, thank you. I had a question for Denis. What do you think the effect of feral oysters settling on our shores is going to have on the soft shell clam industry? I've seen some pictures from the Downeast, where it looks like these escapees are spreading and pretty much reefing on the bottom of the shores and around the rocks, which I think is going to smother the clams. Is that correct?
That's a unique question, Bailey, and it's hard for me to kind of answer that. Certainly, the Downeast is the jewel of the coast of Maine, as I like to say. They are the one estuary that has all species of shellfish in commercial harvesting values historically. So they've had them all there historically, they've had them all harvesting, so it can happen. When we look at other areas that have similar habitats, we're not seeing them overrun. Part of it is it's a different type of habitat. Are there concerns? Sure, yeah. We're seeing oysters settle out because of aquaculture in many different areas. What are the positives? What are the negatives on that aspect to it? The habitat is physically different. Oysters don't want to settle on that physical mud. They want something hard to cement onto and hold on to. So how do we look at that aspect and the concerns of it? I've heard all sorts of things of saying, well, they're filtering out the pedovelans in the water column. Is that possible? Sure, if you have high populations of it. But I can point to Wellfleet Harbor, where in Wellfleet Harbor, we have a lot more oyster aquaculture going on, and yet you have massive amounts of Logie Bay with huge clam populations and quahog populations just subtidally in those areas. So we have all those three species all in the same area, all doing perfectly fine. So it's a different kind of question. Again, each town and each area is unique on it. It's a concern that we have to sit down and look at, but I don't know. I can't answer that question entirely for you, Bailey.
Thank you, Denis. That's a really interesting question, Bailey. I know I'm on the Bar Harbor Shellfish Committee, and we've also observed a little bit, not many, but a little bit of oysters in areas where we hadn't seen them before, and it's just made us wonder what that means. So it's a great question. Marissa, quahogs, but I think you also had other comments you wanted to touch on. So,
well, it was along the same thread of the quahog conversation. I just, I think that the survey, it's a good example of where the surveys and the data collected through surveys can be really useful, specifically with quahogs being, a species that appears to be potentially increasing in abundance, if not at least very much increasing in landings, and a species that we don't necessarily know a whole lot about in terms of population trends. And so, that could potentially present a danger in terms of, harvesting a species without knowing a lot about it, in terms of, potential overharvesting. Maybe not, but I feel like that's just one of these sort of areas where the more that we can learn about what's happening with this population, the better, and the sort of better informed we can go forward with managing it. I think it's also, again, and many people have mentioned this, worth pointing out that, the quahog is interesting in that it is presumably less susceptible to green crab predation because it has this harder, thicker shell, so it can outgrow the crushing strength of the green crab. And it also is, I think, we don't know this for sure, and hopefully can do some experiments to maybe test this, but potentially less susceptible to milky ribbonworm predation as well, because it has a shell that seals all the way shut, unlike a soft shell clam. And the milky ribbonworm preys on clams by shooting its proboscis into the clam when it's partially open. So that's just, ecologically and biologically kind of interesting differences between the soft shell and the hard shell clam. But to Sara Randall's point, I also think that it's really important that we don't, forget about soft shell clams by any means, because quahogs aren't everywhere. I mean, they're in very sort of tight little pockets along the coast. And so not everyone has access to them. And, the vast majority of the state of Maine is still really, mostly soft shell clam habitat and not necessarily quahog habitat. So, of course, I think that's an important thing to point out as well.
Great, thanks. Any other questions or comments from any of you on the panel for each other or?
General question. How often do softshell clams need to come out of the water and have exposure to the air?
So Nate, they don't have to come out of the water. There are populations around the world of softshell clams, some that never come out of the water. So you will see subtidal populations of softshell clams that are that never come out. So Chesapeake Bay, Maryland, their entire population of softshell clams are strictly subtidal. So the harvesting method is escalation. It's a mechanical harvesting method as opposed to our hand harvesting traditionally in the New England region in Maine. So they don't have to come out of water.
That seems an interesting question too, because it was one of you, I can't remember if it was Kevin maybe, who talked about observing what appeared to be differences in how low tide goes. Was that you, Kevin? And changes in the actual tide range. Maybe it was Bailey.
It was Joanie, I remember.
Ah. Thank you for that, Sarah. Yeah, Joanie, so tell us a little bit more about changes that you're seeing in the actual, how far down the tide goes.
Well, yeah, I mean, when it went out, I mean, you had a lot of time to dig and you were able to go out there to dig, but now you can't because the clams aren't out there anymore anyways, but you just get to digging and it's like all of a sudden, jeepers, the tide's back in already, but then it stops and you still have quite a while before you go all the way in, to finish digging inside a little bit, but outside there's just like no digging going on. There's just no time factor anymore where there always was. So the tide, obviously the water really is rising.
I have a question for Joanie. Can I go? So Joanie, I've heard you're a well-known hand picker, right?
Oh.
So have you, and I think I heard in your previous statements about a transition to hoe digging. Have you made that transition, or are you, can you speak to more about that? Because, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, because one of the things is the problems with one of the many of the clams being concentrated in the high intertidal is that area is harder to pick at. There's more rocks. It's not really, it's harder for the hand pickers to safely harvest without much damage to your hands, right?
Right, yes. I even know a girl that she actually sprained her hand trying to pick one time. It was so hard, but no, I did transition over to the hoe digging. I had to if I wanted to live. I didn't have another job. So I did learn how, and the diggers, very good at teaching you how to do it correctly and all, and even built me the right clam hod. I mean, not the clam hod, sorry, the fork. And I did learn how to do it and I got pretty good at it, but I still like picking much better. And I go back to that whenever I can. And the mud has gotten soft enough for that now. So the colder weather, I'll use a fork. Did I answer everything?
I was going to say, it's interesting hearing all these accounts of the clam concentrations being in the high intertidal, because Scarborough still has quite a few spots where the clams don't show unless it's a big negative drainer. And I know hearing from different dealers, I don't know if this is just a tactic to, drive the price. But they always say when the drainer tides are coming around, the guys down east, who knows what that really means, that they're going to be able to reach clam flats lower in the table that are going to be more productive, and they can only be hit on certain phases of the tide cycle. But
and how does that play out, Nate? Because I think I understood you saying that you're in sort of lower river estuaries. How does that play out for you in that kind of an environment, which is different than everyone else, I think?
yeah, so I feel like we have a pretty uniform distribution of some clams in high spots that, break right at 3 hours before low tide. And then there are still a lot of spots that you can't even dig unless it's a drainer tide. Scarborough has like 54 licensed diggers, I think. And I'd say about half of them are pretty active, and everyone's really spread out. There's a lot of different flats that can be dug in the town of Scarborough, and it seems like it's really random where clams really seed in. I know a lot of the older diggers, there's one specific area, None Such Point, they said that area has seeded in for the past 70 years, but in the past 5-6 years, there's nothing commercially harvestable on that piece of flat at all.
Yeah, Kevin, go ahead.
I just wanted to add a point to what Nate said. It's awful strange how the tidal currents will bring in certain seed sets at different times. I've been talking to people in other towns that seem to have gotten seed sets, and why Yarmouth hasn't gotten one in specific areas is kind of beyond me. Now, coming from a municipal standpoint, being a harvester in a single municipality, I also wanted to get back to what Bailey said. We need more participation from the academics and the scientists to come talk to us about what's going on. There is definitely a huge disconnect with the harvesters and the Department of Marine Resources. We have a huge amount of older guys and women that have been digging in this state for as long as I've been alive. They have a huge amount of information to be able to provide. But when you have these people come to a survey and the Department of Marine Resources says you have 800 bushels in a cove and we can't dig 40, you have just basically alienated all of these salt of the earth people. You just no longer want to listen to the Department of Marine Resources. So we've caused our own problem. Now, as a harvester, I look out at the bay and I say, there's no way that I can stop global climate change. As far as I can tell, the climate's never stopped changing in 4 billion years. There's no way that I can stop, 7 trillion green crabs. You might as well stand down there with the broom and push at the tide so you can dig a little bit longer. It doesn't seem feasible. There's no way we can get rid of, 8 billion worms that are killing the population of soft-shelled clams. But one thing that we can do way better is start to collaborate and corroborate about the information that's truly out there and find a way to use this for all of our benefit. I'd like to talk about the surveys for a moment. When we go into an area, we go every 50 feet and we dig a 2x2 area and we form this grid pattern. It's very labor intensive. Now, commercial harvesters should be doing this. We should be giving back something from what we're getting. We're the ones benefiting from this resource. And the vast majority of us don't mind doing this. But when we go out there and then we have these people sitting on town councils or shellfish boards that really don't know what the information is that they're looking at, this just starts to further alienate the people in the industry that know what's going on, and nobody seems to want to listen. Like back to the green crab thing. We were screaming about the green crab thing for 2 years before the Department of Marine Resources even decided, well, maybe we have a green crab problem. I mean, we've got to stop this interfighting and start listening to the people that actually know. Now, there is a problem, you know, we've got some older guys who don't want to tell you what's going on. If you're 2 mortgage payments behind and you know where there's a patch of clams, you don't necessarily want to tell everybody, you know, the clams are doing good over on this side of the bay. Now, you know, that's an inherent problem. But we need to do a much better job. Me, myself, I would rather stick my clam hole through my foot than sit here for 2 hours in a seminar, just to be honest, folks. You know, I just miss the days of just going digging, paying my bills. But honestly, deep inside, I think those days are over. We all need to start working together better. And if you want the people with the real information to start showing up, we've got to open our hands a little bit better to these people. And I thank all the harvesters, all the academics, and all the people on this panel today for participating.
Thanks, Kevin. Kevin, you and Bailey have brought up some really important points, and I wanted to give Denis a chance to just sort of share a DMR perspective, not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot. And then I'd also love to hear a little bit from Sarah Risley about sort of, you know, from what you're hearing from Kevin and Bailey about the importance of sort of opening the lines of communication and listening to harvester perspectives, sort of reflect a little bit more on the project that you're up to. So let's go with Denis first.
Okay. Yeah, I get thick skin. You know, I will sit here and listen, and Kevin knows. Kevin and I have had numerous conversations and disagreements at time periods on a lot of these topics. And I do, certainly I am hearing them. I do understand that. When we look at population surveys, you know, they are a snapshot. They are, you know, there's assumptions on there for every square inch of that cove when you calculate them out. So certainly, you know, you have to dig out every square inch of that cove to get those those numbers out of what's there. That's not always what a commercial harvester is looking at. They're looking at that high density population of those one little spots, those little runs and rills where you're going to have the high densities at. That's not the way a clam survey works. We're looking at the entire flat, whether it's every 50 feet or every 100 feet. There's assumptions put in there on a 1x2 foot plot. It's a linear plot transect. It's been around for a very long time period, but we have to be guarded and careful on making assumptions on what that survey tells you. It doesn't mean that, look, there's 800 bushels here, you know, that they're all in one location. It's across that whole area. So can the department do a better job defining out and looking at those specific high density populations? Sure. That puts a lot more effort and work on doing that survey when we're doing that. And then we're looking at doing that. So when we're out doing our walkover surveys or conducting our regular, you know, linear plot transects, these population surveys, we're using GPSs, we're GPSing those plots. We're starting to put more modern tools with GIS monitoring, GIS mapping to these processes so we can look at those populations much better. So that's an issue. I have been screaming about green crabs forever. I have always been saying that. I have never said one thing, you know, that we're not seeing them. That's always been my concern. There are so many issues involved in settling clams. It's a $64 million question. I can think of at least 10 issues that can cause an entire stop of a year class of clams instantly. And now you're talking a 2 to 3 year delay on that drop off of that landing. So if we lose them in 2013, it's going to be in about 2016 that we see the drop off on those landings. Well, lo and behold, we look at landings and we see that there's a lag time period. The problem is now we're at a population low. As we see biomass dropping off, we're going to have less of those critters being put into, as Sarah was talking about, so the spawning in the water column. So those petavalents in the water column means, you know, the settlement of clams or recruitment. So we get to a population low. Where do we get that to start climbing back up? It is amazing biologically that we're digging clams on the coast of Maine because there are so many predators, so many issues with settlement for clams happening, but yet we have been for 100, 200 plus years. Are the populations dropping or stabilizing? It's hard to say. because we've seen the history and the change of how we harvest clams change in the last 50 years, never mind the last 100 years. It's not a bait industry anymore. It's not done in the winter time period. It's done in the summertime period. And that's a transition in the last 50 years, less than that. 1970s, there was primarily a winter fishery. Yes, there was some bigger digging going on in the summer months, but there were little town programs. It was a wide open harvest. So how do we look at those numbers and how do we look at that? 2-inch clam law didn't come back into the state of Maine. It went out in the 1962, came back in 1980, the 2-inch clam law. And we can see those things change. There's positive and negatives to those 2-inch clam laws, because I certainly know a clam down east in Lubec and Eastport will never, ever make it to 2 inches. They're physically out of water more time than they are in water. Whereas I know there are other areas in the coast, Yarmouth, Freeport, clams can grow very, very quickly in a time period. So there are challenges that we have across here and understanding that in each location. I think my biologists in my program do as well as we can to listen to everybody. We try to work within that system and tailor make each town's program to what needs to be done.
Thank you, Dennis. Sarah, any thoughts, any further thoughts on, sort of collecting the information that harvesters possess from their years and years of experience on the flats, and how that research can contribute to management?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, one of the first things that this study has just really revealed and is kind of, we had these ideas already, but just this kind of supports that harvester knowledge is so essential to effective management and timely management. So we're talking about all these changes that are taking place on the river, and it's just really, really hard to stay on top of what is actually occurring out there on the flats. But there are people we talked with who spend 365 days a year out on the mudflats, on the Manomet, and in the Downeast, so they see what's going on. So I think what was really interesting about the survey was it kind of demonstrated, well, here's a way that we can be collecting this kind of information, hopefully every year. And so we're thinking about, we're in the process currently of developing this paired monitoring and education program in the Downeast, where we'll be choosing sentinel sites, we'll be collecting, information on shellfish and their predators, but we also are including the collection of local knowledge from harvesters on an annual basis, and then finding ways to communicate that back to the shellfish communities to say, here's what's happening, and sort of taking the scientific knowledge that we have and the local knowledge that you all have and kind of putting it on an even playing field where these two types of knowledge can be talking together. Because I think, and Kevin was talking about this too, just this lack of communication and cooperation. So trying to find ways that we can do that, and starting in Downeast, but then making this survey so it's something that could be replicated elsewhere in Maine, is something that we're really working on right now too, and would love feedback or thoughts on, because we just see it as incredibly important and something that, as things are changing more quickly, we'll have to be really on top of, and soon.
Thank you, Sarah. The topic that we're sort of circling right now regarding the knowledge of harvesters compared to the knowledge of the scientists and the managers, really the crux of this whole panel, right, is the hope to sort of bring the lines of communication between those two groups a little bit more closely. I'm thinking of Marissa for a second, because you have a foot in the science community, but you're also from a nonprofit. So how does that fit?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I apologize. I have a puppy that's barking in the background, so some noise, I apologize. No, I think that's exactly where a nonprofit can fit in and be able to, sort of span those boundaries. And that's really the approach that we take at Manomet in any of the work we do. I mean, we work in sort of a lot of different fisheries, not just shellfish, but we really try to start, all of our projects, all of our ideas all of our research from, start from a place of listening first to the industry members who are, most closely tied to the resources and most impacted by changes in the resources. And then, working in collaborative ways to build sort of the questions that need to be answered, or, build projects around producing information that is useful to harvesters, useful to industry, useful to co-management. And so, it's definitely, it's a slower process maybe, I think, than is sort of, the traditional way of thinking about, designing an experiment and going out and doing your experiment and collecting your data. Lately, I keep saying that we have been working at the speed of trust, because it really takes a lot of building relationships and building trust with industry to have a really effective collaborative partnership. But I think that is something that we really try to do our best with, and hopefully, by doing so, end up with, results and with projects and, data to answer questions that have a greater impact ultimately.
Great. A couple questions that are unrelated to where we've been talking right now. So I don't want to leave this yet, because I want to make sure that everybody who has thoughts around this gets a chance to share them or respond to what you've already heard. Bailey.
One thing we did before COVID came and pretty much screwed up our world is we were beginning to have meetings with shellfish harvesters in Washington and Hancock County. And at one of the meetings we had, the question was asked, how many years experience do you have in the industry? And there was over 500 years of shellfish harvesting knowledge in the room. And the academia that was there really took advantage of that. And I think that's something we need to see more of. And I understand Kevin's point that when you're a couple payments behind, your lips are pretty tight. But when you're 75, 80 and you're at the end of the game and you want your grandson to go clamming or granddaughter, you're more willing to get off some of that information that you've held. And these guys that have been in it for that amount of years, their memories go back further than the department's institutional history. So these are the guys that understand the cyclical nature, or we've seen this before. And I think that's really a key thing that needs to be written down, or what are the abnormalities that these guys have seen in their life, and will it come around again? But I think, it's having meetings like this where harvesters can get together and speak pretty much freely without giving away our secrets too much. I think this is a great thing that we're doing. So thank you for putting this whole thing on.
Great, thanks, Bailey. Any other thoughts? Bailey actually just provided a great segue to one of the other themes that we have. So I'll go ahead and pose it. Must show me a quick hand if you still had a thought. Okay. So Bailey talked about, the years of knowledge that harvesters have out on the flats, which immediately raises the question about the next generation, right? Is how to transmit that knowledge to the next generation. And so this question is a little bit both for Joanie and for Nate. And for Joanie, because you mentioned that your Shellfish Committee is really interested in doing some education and engaging the next generation. And for Nate, the question is purely based on the fact that of the 4 harvesters in the room, I think that you said you've been at it about a decade, which is less than your colleagues in the room. So you're perhaps representative of the youth for at least us here today. So it'd be great to hear from you a little bit also about what's pulled you into this industry, and how do you see your generation sort of going forward? Let's go to Joanie first, and then we'll go to Nate.
Okay, so what exactly is your question?
So yeah, right, good point. I didn't actually raise the question. So the question is, tell us a little bit more about what you guys are hoping to do to engage youth in
Well, we started that free program last year, actually, and we're going to continue it again this year. We only got 2 in on it. One of them was my granddaughter, and another one was another clam digger that had a neighbor that had a son, and he asked him. I've actually even been at the landing before and seen kids hanging around. I'd be like, why are you hanging around? You're old enough to be working. And my husband and I have actually recruited a couple of kids that way. But now I've been looking for other diggers to take kids, but they're afraid of if they get hurt on their boat and insurance reasons. And plus with everything going on, not just COVID, but before that, just the things going on about kids claiming, oh, he touched me or he said something wrong to me. So there's just a lot of that scare there that people don't want to recruit the kids, but we can at least recruit them to show them where they can go dig and walk in, things like that. But we're losing our youth to clamming. There's not many out there.
Yeah. Nate, thank you, Joanie.
So I think one of the biggest barriers, honestly, to youth getting into the industry is not being able to get a license. So I'm actually still a student digger. I go to school at UNE in Biddeford, so I'm still a full-time student. I can keep my license, but this is my second to last year with the clam license, and thankfully I have a lobster license too, so I can pursue that. And I think my time in this industry has encouraged me to want to pursue ventures in aquaculture and, look into ways that, soft shell clams can be farmed. Other species can be farmed in ways that utilize areas that typically had been soft shell clam flats that in the future may no longer have soft shell clams in such abundances. I think that the student programs have been really strong. Scarborough has 8 student diggers, I think, and I would say that pretty much all those student diggers go pretty consistently throughout the summer, and it has been a success. But I know for some of my friends who've aged out of the student program and myself, caring about the industry, being involved, living it really, and then suddenly losing a license. I mean, the industry is going to lose me caring about it in a way, not being out there actively engaged doing it. I'm still going to be, in the industry, I guess, in a way, but can't actually go clam. So it's kind of a loaded question, I guess.
Would you mind explaining why, once your student license is expired, I guess is the word, what's limiting you from getting a clam license?
Just the way that most of the municipal ordinances are set up based on a lottery system. I know at the second to last lottery we had, there was like 2 licenses and there was like 70 applicants. And I mean, it was people who just got out of work at the orthodontist's office, about to head to their Palm Beach home. And they're like, oh, maybe I'll get a clamming license. Meanwhile, we're all sitting there hoping that we're going to get a clamming license so we can keep doing what we've been doing for the past decade. But, and I guess that's just like every fisheries thing ever comes down to entrance. What are the fees going to be? How restricted is it going to be? Who's going to be able to get into it? And I think that is a fundamental problem of a lot of our systems, licensing systems in the state, because like the lobster program, I personally went through my apprenticeship, got my lobster license, and now I have a lobster license and I can keep that heritage going, fight for proper rules, regulations, but now it's almost like the clamming industry is going to lose its base and its heritage if it keeps going on this lottery system, because people who have corporate jobs are going to keep drawing licenses. They're not going to use the licenses, which leads to harder management practices, not knowing what pressure is actually on the flats compared to how many licenses are issued. And there's just a whole fallout of issues, I guess, that, all these municipalities are going to be facing in the coming years, especially as more people retire and age out of digging full time.
Thanks, Nate. Yeah, we'll go to Kevin in a second. I'm just being aware of time. So we're going to work towards beginning to wind it down. And this topic of sort of the next generation of the fishery seems like a really good one to kind of focus on for a couple minutes before we have to sign off. So Kevin, yes, go for it.
You know, I agree with Nate. You know, for a long time, I've only dug clams for 23 years, and I say only dug clams for 23 years because the vast majority of people have been doing it a lot longer than me. So we have had this politically correct movement to get these student licenses, and that's fine. But one of the problems with that is you actually have to have a resource for these people to dig. You can't give away student licenses when you can barely justify the commercial diggers you have at the time. One of the things that Yarmouth has done is we set up a point system where the more surveys you come on and perform with the town, it gives you points towards any upcoming licenses. So then these people can come out onto the flats with the experienced diggers, do some surveys, get a feel for the lay of the land, get a feel for how things are dug, things you want to look for, talk to the people in the industry. So then as you integrate these people, they're actually the ones willing to put in the time to help the resource and to help the municipality. So this is something that you might want to think about, you know, educating other municipalities to doing and fine tuning this so we can get another generation of younger people that enjoy this. I mean, I totally blew it on career day, and I was very, very lucky to be able to get into the commercial clamming industry. I think statistically I had a better shot at becoming an astronaut, but you know, the clamming has been very good to me, and I want to see the younger generations be able to get involved, but there's got to be a correct way to do this without injuring the resource that is already in decline.
Thank you, Kevin. Any other thoughts about the next generation and sort of where you hope that the collaboration between research and clammers goes? Sarah Randall.
I just wanted to say I was glad that Nate brought that up because that is a major problem. And I think that is why people are going into aquaculture, because that's actually like a way for young people to get involved in fisheries, or at least have a chance to continue, you know, what maybe their, you know, generational livelihoods of being able to work on the water in Maine's coastal culture. So that's a big factor in why we're seeing like younger people going into aquaculture, because they're not able to get these licenses because of limited entry. But then of course, what Kevin's saying too, you know, it's all connected. And unfortunately, the water temperatures are predicted to continue to rise, which are going to create more and more predation, and it's going to have impacts. And we got to work to find solutions to enhance these clam populations.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Anne.
Natalie, thank you for letting me exert my privilege here. I wanted to say that I want to end on a positive note. And one of the things that we're doing here in Brunswick is we have just spent a year modifying our ordinance so that we give students with licenses. We have a tremendous student license program, thanks to one of our high school teachers who runs the program through the high school. I think we have 15 student diggers, 8 or 9 of whom are very active. And so we've just modified the ordinance to give them a leg up in the lottery system to avoid exactly the problem that Nate is talking about. And these are a group of young men and women who are very enthusiastic about the opportunity to participate in this fishery going forward. So whether we're going to be able to protect the soft shell clams or not, this is an industry that is bigger than that. Yes, we can't give up on the clams, but quahogs are king here in Brunswick now. They are in Georgetown. And, you know, we need to work with the system that we have.
Thank you, Anne. All right. Any other closing thoughts from anyone? Dennis.
So obviously this program there's challenges to the municipal program, and what I'm seeing across the coast, and it's not just for the state of Maine, the clam digging population or the clam harvesters are getting old. We're seeing that. There are very, very few younger ones coming in. Nate, it's great to see you coming into this, but I'm seeing a lot more, I'm in my mid 50s, and I would be, in general, the average age or younger side of most of the clam harvesters across the coast of Maine. The challenge is, how do we get the younger guys and gals to come into this end of the industry? It's a challenge. It's hard. There are other marine industries that you can go into to make better money, less labor intensive, a whole host of things. These were always considered what was called industries of last resort. It's unfortunate. How do we transition to get the younger and the newer harvesters in there? Because I think they have a lot to offer, not just the youth and strength in many ways to get out there, but I think they can add a lot to that, and that's a challenge. But how do we balance that approach on coming in? Down east, it's open license sales. There's no such thing as a lottery and limited licenses. So the opportunities are much higher, but we're still not seeing those younger individuals coming in with the opportunities to dig down east. Southern Maine, there are probably more clam diggers than there are clams at this point in time. Everyone, and I hear what Nate's saying, everyone thinks they're going to make their millions digging clams. Well, Bailey, and Joanie and Kevin can tell you, it's backbreaking work. It is cold, it's miserable, it's sweltering hot, and it is just miserable to make, the freedom of making money and being able to make a living is certainly different. You are the master of your own work. And we're always listening to the municipalities, and we're always working on trying to, how do we have opportunities for all individuals to have access to these resources in some fashion. It is a challenge across the state because each town has a different means. Down East town might be handled and run by lobstermen, and they want to dig clams entirely different than a clam digger. Southern Maine, it's a whole different story. There are opportunities for better employment in Southern Maine, so people will shift off of those positions, but they never give up that license. They want to hold on to it in their pocket just in case the economy drops. They have something to come back to. But is that right or is that wrong? I'm not the one to say that. That's up to the town and the municipalities to make those decisions on how they want to manage their resources. It's different than the state controlling and limiting those numbers. I have 5 towns that dig more clams right now than the entire state of Rhode Island. And in Rhode Island, the state controls everything. They tell you the when, where, and how. They do all the work. They say X numbers of harvesters, you will harvest X numbers of clams at this time period, period. There's very little input. Sure, they might have industry input meetings, but the state ultimately is going to be the one controlling that. Ours is a partnership. And it is very different from down east to mid-coast to Southern Maine. And it's tailor making it to each municipality to make these programs work. It's the only way it's going to work.
Thank you, Dennis. We are at the end of our couple hours. This is such a great conversation, and I hate to close it, but I think I have to. Dennis, thank you so much for allowing us to put you on the spot. This ended up being a little bit unfair for you because you were on a researcher panel, but you're also representing the management agency. So of course, people are going to ask you the hard questions. So I really appreciate also the harvesters asking the hard questions. So thank you so much for that. I just wanted to thank everyone for their time today. Thanks so much to the folks who have been listening in for the last couple hours. Really great questions. I think we got to most of them. So I'm glad for that. There was 1 or 2 more comments that we didn't have a chance to get to, but thanks for letting us know you had those comments, folks. Thanks for listening, everyone. So very specifically, thanks to our first panelists, in particular, Nate Orff from Scarborough, Kevin Oliver from Yarmouth, Joanie Mcdonald from Georges River, and Bailey Bowden from Penobscot. Thank you so much. And your comments about wanting to continue to make sure that knowledge from the harvesters gets heard and documented, I think has been heard loud and clear and is really important. And then also thank you so much for all the panelists who were representing your research projects. Sara Randall from the Downeast Institute, Denis Nault from the Department of Marine Resources, Marissa McMahan from Manomet, and Sarah Risley from the University of Maine Darling Center. Also a special thanks to Anne Hayden and Marissa and Sarah Risley for your help putting on this great event. Really couldn't have done it without you. And sort of a sideway thank you also to Jessica Joyce, who also did a bunch of help to pull this together. And I think with that, we are done for today. Thank you, everyone.